killed in Sicily. Frank, of course, landed in Africa, Sicily, and Omaha Beach. And he also remembered Pappy Anderson, a dear buddy, and he was killed next to Frank on D-Day. I recommend everyone reading this wonderful book. He was on D-Day, and then 10 days afterwards, he was on a patrol and hit by a sniper. He ordered his men to go back. The Germans took him, had to take out his lung. They had no anesthesia, just gave him a couple of shots of cognac. He never talked about it, but he told me, we're losing so many of our local veterans here in Naples and Marco, Fort Myers. Frank, of course, Bedford Biles of Marco. At 12:30 on D-Day, he dropped out of a C-47 down onto Normandy, to that unbelievable hell below. He was a wonderful, wonderful friend. And there's Earl Hodges, who this university is named for. He was too young at 16 to get in the Army, so he joined the Merchant Marine. But when he became of age, he joined the Army and went to Korea. And another dear friend who died a few years ago used to be mayor of this town, Ned Putzel, who always had breakfast once a month. Ned was born in New Orleans. His family was from France. And he went over every summer to be with his family in France. He spoke French like a native. So when the war came along, he was dropped into France as a civilian and sent back vital information for our invasion on D-Day. But one thing bothered him. He said to me, Peter, look at this history book. He said, there's only a page and a half about the Second World War. We've got to tell the children today about the Second World War and all the D-Day and all the other wars in the Pacific. So he formed a little committee, and we all went around to the schools. Ned, Frank, Bedford, Bob, Mixa, and we talked to the children and told them. And 2 weeks before he died, we were supposed to go to Marco, and he was very ill. And I told him, I said, Ned, you don't have to go. He said, I'm going. And I'll never forget him standing up there, as sick as he was, talking proudly of our country and our army. You know, my mind goes back to 1943 and half of 1944. So many memories. My parents, of course, came from there. My father was a Welshman from Swansea. My mother was from Salisbury. And I grew up hearing about the First World War. My grandfather was Colonel Charles Addenbrooke, and he fought in the trenches in France. And Mom lost her uncle in the First World War. And in the Second World War, her brother, Derek Addenbrooke, was shot down and killed. I admired the British, but I was an American. I'm proud of it. And I wish you could have seen the faces of the men in those days in England. It's such an unbelievable memory. And they were different. We were different. And I asked Bob Mixa, I said, Bob, why were we? He agreed with me. I said, what made us different? And he said, because we grew up the hard way. We were all products of the Depression. No one gave us anything. If we wanted something, we had to get it ourselves. So many memories of England in 43. I remember at night, look up at that dark black sky see the searchlights piercing the darkness, the sound of anti-aircraft guns. And every now and then you'd see a German plane burst into flames. There was so much damage done to England during the war. We were stationed for a while near an 8th Air Force base. And every morning, we'd hear those engines of the B-17s and the B-24s rising into the air on their bomb runs. And we'd look for them as they came back. Many of them missing. Many of them shot up. My brother was a gunner on the B-24, and Stella's two brothers, her twins, were both on the B-17s. You know, near Cambridge, England, there's the American Airmen's Cemetery. Buried there are 4,000 brave Americans. And then they have this wall of remembrance with the names of over 5,000 Americans who were never brought home. Their bodies were never brought back. And Glenn Miller was one of them. His name was there. He did so much for us, in London, just to hear him playing our songs from America. And after the war, I was asked to do a program called Bring Back the Bands with Carol Channing. And one day, we had Ray McKinley to be interviewed, and he was Glenn Miller's drummer. And I'll never forget talking to him, and he told me what a dedicated soldier Glenn Miller was. And we became friends. He moved to Marco, and he died just a few years ago. You know, to prepare for D-Day, there were so many activities that went on. On the Isle of Wight, there are cliffs higher than Pont de Hoc in Normandy. And the 2nd Ranger Battalion, I think part of the 5th Ranger Battalion, went to the Isle of Wight with those cliffs. I talked to them on the 50th anniversary, and they told me they took grappling hooks from the London Fire Department, attached to ropes, and shot them to the top of the cliff. And these guys went straight up. They practiced this over and over and over again. And on D-Day, that was the first thing. They had to knock out Pont de Hoc first because the 155s were there, and they could zero in on any of our beaches. And so they got Pont de Hoc. I think out of 350 of them survived. And then there was the Ghost Army in Dover under George Patton. They put rubber tanks, jeeps, thousands of soldiers marching around. They wanted to trick and fool Adolf Hitler to think that we were going to invade Calais, which is the closest point to England. And when we landed in Normandy, Hitler said, no, that's not the real thing. And he held back his panzers. I think it was about a week, wasn't it, Bob? 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, we were able to bring in men, supplies. The Red Ball Express was going full strong in those 2 weeks. Then there was the tragic incident that no one knew about. For 20 years, it was kept secret. But there was a full rehearsal for D-Day. I just cannot believe what happened. The hundreds of men with Higgins boats and went over and over what they were going to do. And on the second day, around 1 o'clock, German submarines surfaced and annihilated thousands of our LSTs, tanks, trucks, everything. And over 800 men dead. And not one word was ever let out. Because they said, can you imagine if the world hears about Slapton Sands, an outcry would come and would prevent D-Day. And it was a top secret for 20 years. I'll never forget those months before D-Day. Every country road in England seemed jammed with tanks, trucks, jeeps, and those great American faces. We went down to a big building on Plymouth, in Plymouth. And we went in, put our stuff on the bunks downstairs. And then we went out in the courtyard and they issued us greased ammunition and a little book on how to get along with the French. And I was paid in French francs, I think it was $70 because I was a private. That night, we had the greatest dinner. I've never seen anything like it. We had turkey, ham, steak, all the desserts, and my buddy said they're fattening us up for the kill. But it was the best meal I'd ever had in the Army. And the next morning, we fell out in the company street, and they had these loudspeakers all around. And over the speakers came the voice of General Eisenhower. I'd like to read what he said because it made an unbelievable impression on all of us. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon a great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you in company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts. You will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, your devotion to duty, and your skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck. And let us all beseech the blessings of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. We then marched down to the boats. I was on an English ship full of replacements. They would need plenty of replacements on D-Day. And we were on our way to Normandy. And this is what we had trained for so long. Our minds were so filled with so many thoughts of home and our families. And the chaplains had services. And I met this young man from Washington, state of Washington, reading the Bible, and he had a verse that I knew very well. And we started talking, became friends. And he was the son of a minister too. And sadly, he was killed at the Sanlo breakthrough. But we sang hymns on deck. We were ready. And we got on our boats, went down the rope ladder into the boats, and went in to Normandy. Spent the first night on the cliff in German trenches with the German dead still there. And our duffel bags never came in, so we were very cold that first night. Very cold. And they strafed, and they bombed the beach. But we were in Normandy to do our job. 10 years after the war, I was living in Connecticut with my wonderful family. And I don't know, it was wintertime. But I remembered, I just started thinking about D-Day. And I sat down, and Stella will tell you, I just wrote it. Just came from inside. And I'd like to read that poem for you now. It's called Omaha Beach. When we went in, the beach had been taken. The living fought on, the dead forsaken. We were dropped into water up to our shoulders. We waded in, a group of green soldiers, onto that thin strip of beach so many had tried to reach. They were the ones who went in first, among the machine gun fire and shell burst. They went to watery graves, sinking below the waves. The water was red, red from the dead, red from the dying in agony crying. Those who made the land were not able to stand. Every advantage was on the hill. They murdered our men at will. The rain of death from the cliffs never stopped. Never stopped. But we just kept coming in from the sea, wave after wave, as far as you could see. Sheer courage and determination, not believing they were done, dictated the victory that day. Others in the future will say, when they stand on that mighty height and look down on that thin strip of beach, they'll say, I don't see how they ever did it. I'll never forget that beach, never. I'll never forget the men in the ships, in the air, and on the land, and in the water.